The scent of fresh ink and glossy paper filled the air as Mrs. Henderson distributed the yearbooks, each one landing on desks with a satisfying thump. I watched my classmates eagerly flip through pages, searching for their photos, their memories, their proof that they existed in this place for 4 long years. My hands trembled slightly as I opened my copy of Westfield High Memories 2024. The forest green cover felt cold beneath my fingertips, and I could hear the distant hum of the air conditioning mixing with excited chatter around me. Sarah Chen was already squealing about her senior portrait while Marcus Williams pointed out his football photos to anyone within earshot. I turned to page 37, the National Honor Society group photo. 23 students arranged in 3 neat rows on the library steps, all wearing our navy blue polo shirts and genuine smiles. I had stood in the back row, third from the left, between Jessica Rivera and Tom Bradley. I remembered the day clearly, the photographer's jokes, the way the marble steps felt rough beneath my feet, the scent of Jessica's vanilla perfume mixing with the spring air. But in the yearbook, I wasn't there. The photo showed 22 students. Jessica and Tom stood closer together, as if I had never existed between them. The cropping was seamless, professional. To anyone else, it would look completely natural. My breath caught in my throat. I flipped frantically through more pages. Student council officers, I was secretary, but only the other 4 appeared in the photo. Academic decathlon team, 8 members instead of 9. Valedictorian announcement, my name nowhere to be found, despite my 4.7 GPA that had surpassed everyone else's by a significant margin. Let me see yours, Elena. Madison Walsh leaned over, her strawberry blonde hair falling across my desk like a curtain. Madison, whose father owned half the commercial real estate in town. Madison, who had somehow become valedictorian despite her 4.3 GPA. I slammed the yearbook shut, the sound echoing through the classroom like a gunshot. Madison's perfectly glossed lips curved into what might have been concern if I didn't know better. "Everything okay?" she asked, but her blue eyes held a glimmer that made my stomach turn. "Fine," I managed, my voice barely above a whisper. But it wasn't fine. Nothing about this was fine. In my first life, this moment had been the beginning of my end. The yearbook revelation had led to a spiral of self-doubt and acceptance of my place as an afterthought. I had graduated quietly, gone to a state school on partial scholarship, and spent the next decade watching Madison and her friends succeed in ways that should have been mine. But this wasn't my first life. This time, I knew exactly what was coming next. The graduation ceremony preparations began 3 weeks later. I sat in the school auditorium as Principal Morrison outlined the events, speeches, awards, the traditional banner unveiling that would feature portraits of our top graduates. This year's banners will showcase our valedictorian Madison Walsh, salutatorian Kevin Chen, and our Outstanding Achievement Award winner. He paused, consulting his notes. Marcus Williams. Marcus Williams. The boy who had barely maintained a 3.0 GPA and whose greatest academic achievement was not falling asleep during senior English. I felt the familiar knot forming in my stomach, but this time it was different. This time, I was prepared. In my first life, I had sat in shocked silence as they announced the achievement awards. I had waited for my name, believing that surely my 4.7 GPA, my early admission to Harvard, my 4 years of perfect attendance would mean something. But they never called my name. They never acknowledged that I existed. They had already erased me from their history. That afternoon, I walked through the empty corridors of Westfield High, my footsteps echoing off the polished linoleum floors. The trophy cases gleamed under fluorescent lights, filled with decades of achievements. Soon, they would add photos from this year's graduating class. Photos that wouldn't include me. I pulled out my phone and dialed a number I had memorized but never used. Blackwood Industries, Mr. Blackwood's office, came the crisp voice of his assistant. "This is Elena Morrison," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "I'd like to speak with my father." The irony wasn't lost on me that Principal Morrison shared my surname. It had been a source of endless confusion during my first life, with teachers often assuming I was his daughter, until they learned the truth. Then their treatment of me made sense. Why favor the scholarship kid when Madison Walsh's family funded the new computer lab? But Principal Morrison wasn't my father. My father was someone I had only learned about after my mother's death in my first life. When I finally found the letter she had hidden in her jewelry box for 18 years, Alexander Blackwood, CEO of Blackwood Industries, the man who had built an empire worth billions, who owned half the state's media outlets, and who had spent 18 years believing his daughter had died at birth. 20 minutes later, I sat in the back seat of a black Tesla Model S, watching Westfield shrink behind me as we drove toward the city. The leather seats smelled expensive, and classical music played softly through speakers that probably cost more than most people's cars. Alexander Blackwood, my father, looked exactly like the photos I had studied obsessively in my first life. Silver hair, impeccably styled, sharp gray eyes that missed nothing, a jaw that spoke of generations of privilege and power. He wore a charcoal suit that probably cost more than my mother's monthly rent. 18 years, he said finally, his voice carrying a mixture of wonder and pain. 18 years I've been looking for you. The DNA test results lay between us on the small table, though we both knew they were just a formality. The resemblance was unmistakable. I had his eyes, his stubborn chin, his analytical mind that could dissect problems with surgical precision. My mother, she thought it was better this way, I said, the words tasting bitter. She didn't want me to grow up feeling abandoned. Abandoned? His laugh held no humor. Elena, I've spent 18 years and millions of dollars searching for you. I hired the best private investigators, followed every lead, traced every Elena Morrison in the country. Your mother was very thorough in hiding you. The weight of this revelation settled over me like a heavy blanket. In my first life, I had learned about him too late. He had died of a heart attack during my sophomore year of college, never knowing I existed. By the time I found my mother's letter, he was already gone, and his empire had been divided among distant relatives. But this time, I had found him while he was still alive, while he could still do something about the injustices that had been done to me. I need your help, I said, meeting his gaze directly. There are people who have wronged me, who have tried to erase me from my own story. I want them to face consequences. His lips curved into a smile that was both proud and predatory. Tell me everything. The transformation began immediately. Within 24 hours, I was no longer Elena Morrison, scholarship student from the wrong side of town. I was Elena Blackwood, heiress to a business empire worth $4 billion. My new penthouse apartment in the city center smelled like expensive candles and fresh flowers. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a view of the entire metropolitan area, including the small suburb of Westfield in the distance. At night, I could see the lights of my old neighborhood, tiny pinpricks that reminded me of how small my world used to be. Your old life ends today, Alexander said, as we stood on the balcony, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of amber and rose. Whatever name you want to use, whatever story you want to tell, it's your choice. But I didn't want to hide anymore. I wanted them to know exactly who I was when I destroyed them. The first part of my plan required patience. I spent 3 weeks learning everything I could about Blackwood Industries, about my father's network, about the intricate web of power and influence that now belonged to me. The company owned media outlets, real estate ventures, technology firms, and most importantly, the bank that held the mortgages for most of Westfield's families, including the Walshes. My father's assistant, Caroline Pierce, was a woman in her 40s with steel gray hair and the organizational skills of a military general. She arranged everything without question: the legal documents that would officially establish my identity, the credit cards with unlimited limits, the security team that would ensure my safety. Your father has waited 18 years for this, Caroline told me as we reviewed the paperwork. He's prepared to give you anything you want. What I wanted was justice. And justice, I was learning, could be bought. In my first life, I had believed that hard work and merit would be enough. I had trusted that the system would recognize my achievements, that fairness would prevail. I had been naive enough to think that being cropped out of photos was just an oversight, that my missing awards were administrative errors. Now I understood the truth. Power wasn't earned through good grades and perfect attendance. Power was inherited, purchased, and wielded by those who understood the game. I was ready to play. 2 weeks before graduation, I made my first move. The Westfield Gazette had been struggling financially for years, sustained only by local advertising and community event coverage. It was a small paper, but it served the entire district and was read by every family in town. I'd like to purchase the Gazette, I told my father over breakfast in his corner office. The morning light streamed through massive windows and the scent of his coffee, some exotic blend that probably cost more per pound than most people made in a day, filled the air. Any particular reason? He asked, though his smile suggested he already knew. Sentimental value. I grew up in Westfield. The purchase was completed within 48 hours. Small-town newspapers weren't exactly prime real estate in the business world, and the previous owner was grateful for the generous offer. My second move came 3 days later. I walked into the offices of Walsh & Associates, the real estate firm that Madison's father had built from the ground up. The reception area smelled like leather furniture and success, with expensive artwork covering the walls and fresh orchids arranged on the receptionist's desk. I'd like to speak with Mr. Walsh about a property acquisition, I told the young woman behind the desk. Her nameplate read Jennifer, and she had the kind of bright, eager smile that suggested she was new to the job. Of course, may I ask what type of property you're interested in? His building. Madison's father, Robert Walsh, was a man who had spent 40 years building his reputation in Westfield. He was tall and distinguished, with graying temples and the confident posture of someone who had never been told no. His office reflected his success: mahogany furniture, diplomas, and awards covering one wall, photographs of handshakes with local politicians. But as he reviewed the purchase offer I had placed on his desk, his confidence began to waver. This is a very generous offer, Miss Blackwood," he said carefully. "But I'm not looking to sell. This building has been our headquarters for 20 years. "Mr. Walsh," I said, settling back in the leather chair across from his desk, "I think you should look more carefully at who's making the offer." He glanced down at the letterhead, and I watched as recognition dawned. Blackwood Industries wasn't just any company. It was the financial powerhouse that could make or break entire markets. "However," I continued, "I'm not unreasonable. The offer stands for 72 hours. After that, I'll be exploring other options for expanding our presence in Westfield." The threat was subtle but clear. Other options might include funding his competitors, calling in loans, or any number of business maneuvers that could destroy a small-town real estate firm. I'll need to discuss this with my partners," he said. "Of course, take your time." I left my card on his desk, heavy cardstock with embossed lettering, and walked out with the satisfaction of seeing Robert Walsh's world begin to crumble. The Walsh building was mine within the week. Robert Walsh had tried to negotiate, had called in favors, had even reached out to other investors for a counteroffer. But when you're competing against unlimited resources, you're destined to lose. With ownership of the building came access to tenant information, lease agreements, and financial records. It was amazing what you could learn about people when you owned the roof over their heads. Madison's family lived in a colonial mansion in Westfield's most exclusive neighborhood. The mortgage was held by Westfield National Bank, which had been purchased by Blackwood Industries the previous year. Their monthly payments were substantial, nearly $8,000, but manageable for a successful real estate firm. Keyword, successful. I spent the following weeks systematically contacting Walsh & Associates' largest clients. Each conversation was brief and professional. "Hello, this is Elena Blackwood from Blackwood Industries. I understand you're currently working with Walsh & Associates on some property transactions. I wanted to let you know that we're expanding our real estate division and would love to discuss how we might better serve your needs. When you represent a billion-dollar corporation, people take your calls. When you offer better rates, faster service, and the backing of unlimited capital, they switch their business." Within 10 days, Walsh & Associates had lost 60% of their client base. I monitored their decline through carefully placed sources. A secretary who gossiped at the coffee shop. A janitor who overheard phone conversations. A delivery driver who noticed the increasing number of "for rent" signs in their office windows. Robert Walsh was making desperate calls to banks, pleading for extended credit lines. Madison's mother had started selling jewelry. The family's country club membership had been quietly canceled, but this was just the beginning. The Westfield High School administration was trickier to handle, but not impossible. The key was understanding that school districts, like any institution, depended on funding and political support. I'd like to establish an educational foundation. I told the district superintendent during a meeting at my father's downtown office. Dr. Patricia Hernandez was a woman in her 50s who had spent her career navigating the complex politics of public education. That's wonderful, Miss Blackwood. What type of programs are you hoping to support? Academic excellence, merit-based scholarships, recognition for students who truly deserve it. We were sitting in my father's conference room with its polished marble table and view of the city skyline. I had arranged for lunch to be catered from the city's most expensive restaurant, and Dr. Hernandez seemed genuinely impressed by the attention. The Blackwood Educational Foundation would provide $50,000 annually to Westfield High, I continued, plus additional funding for special programs and facility improvements. Her eyes widened. $50,000 represented a significant boost to any school's budget, especially one that had been cutting programs for 3 years straight. There would be only one condition, I added casually. I'd want to be involved in selecting the recipients of various academic awards. After all, as the primary donor, I should have some say in ensuring the money goes to students who truly embody excellence. Dr. Hernandez nodded eagerly. Absolutely, we'd welcome your input. Wonderful. I'll have my lawyers drop the paperwork. In my first life, I had never understood how easily institutions could be influenced. I had believed that schools were bastions of fairness, that awards were given based on objective criteria. I had trusted that my grades and achievements would speak for themselves. Now I understood that everything was political. Everything was negotiable. Everything had a price. The graduation ceremony was 2 weeks away when I made my final preparations. The Westfield Gazette, now under new management, was preparing a special graduation edition that would feature extensive coverage of the ceremony. The photographer I had hired was the best in the state, and the layout designer had very specific instructions about which students should be featured prominently. I stood in my penthouse that evening, looking out at the lights of Westfield in the distance. My phone buzzed with updates from Caroline, who was coordinating the various moving pieces of my plan. Caroline. Banner Company confirms order. 3 8x 10-foot banners featuring Elena Blackwood as outstanding graduate. Installation scheduled for tomorrow morning. Caroline. Gazette photographer briefed on graduation coverage priorities. Your speech has been submitted to Principal Morrison. Caroline. Walsh and Associates officially filed for bankruptcy this afternoon. Building foreclosure proceedings begin Monday. I smiled, setting the phone aside. Tomorrow, Madison Walsh would wake up to discover that her valedictorian speech had been reassigned. Tomorrow, the entire town would see my face displayed prominently above the graduation stage. Tomorrow, everyone who had tried to erase me would learn that some people couldn't be cropped out. The scent of jasmine drifted in through the open balcony door, carried on the warm evening breeze. In the distance, I could see the lights of the high school, where custodians were probably setting up chairs and preparing for Saturday's ceremony. They had no idea what was coming. Graduation morning dawned clear and bright, with the kind of perfect blue sky that made everything seem possible. I dressed carefully in a white silk dress that had cost more than most families' monthly grocery budgets, paired with pearl earrings that had belonged to my grandmother, a woman I was only now learning about through family photos and stories. The drive from the city to Westfield took 30 minutes in my new Mercedes. My security detail followed in a separate vehicle, a precaution my father had insisted upon. As we approached the high school, I could see the banners that had been installed overnight. 3 massive displays flanked the entrance to the auditorium, each featuring a larger-than-life portrait. But instead of Madison Walsh, Kevin Chen, and Marcus Williams, the banners showed my face 3 times over. Elena Blackwood. Outstanding graduate. Elena Blackwood. Academic Excellence Award. Elena Blackwood. Blackwood Foundation Scholarship recipient. Parents and students gathered outside the building, pointing and whispering as they read the unfamiliar name. I watched from my car as Madison Walsh arrived with her family, her face pale as she stared up at the banners. I could see her father speaking urgently into his phone, probably calling the school to demand an explanation. But school officials had already been briefed on the situation by Dr. Hernandez, who had made it very clear that the Blackwood Foundation's continued support depended on their cooperation. My phone buzzed with a text from my father. Ready to make your entrance? I was more than ready. The auditorium fell silent as I walked through the main entrance. 400 graduating seniors and their families turned to stare at the young woman they didn't recognize, the one whose face dominated the banners outside. I had chosen my entrance carefully, timing it for maximum impact. The ceremony had already begun, with Principal Morrison welcoming everyone and introducing the school board members. When he saw me walk in, his face went through a series of expressions: confusion, recognition, and finally, carefully masked panic. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice slightly strained, "we have a special guest with us today. Please welcome Elena Blackwood, representing the Blackwood Educational Foundation, which has generously supported our school this year." The applause was polite but puzzled. These people had never heard of Elena Blackwood, had no idea why she warranted special recognition. I walked down the center aisle with confident, measured steps. My heels clicked against the polished floor, the sound echoing through the silent auditorium. I could smell the familiar mixture of floor wax and nervous teenagers that had defined my high school experience. But this time, instead of hiding in the back row, I was walking toward the stage. I took my assigned seat in the front row, directly in front of the podium where Madison Walsh was supposed to give her valedictorian speech. I could feel her staring at the back of my head, could sense her growing panic as she realized that everything was wrong. Principal Morrison cleared his throat. "Before we begin with our traditional ceremonies, we have some important announcements to make regarding this year's academic honors." This was the moment I had been waiting for. Due to a comprehensive review of academic records and achievements, there have been some changes to our announced awards, he continued, his voice growing stronger as he read from the script I had provided. This year's valedictorian with a GPA of 4.7 and early admission to Harvard University is Elena Blackwood. The auditorium erupted in confused murmurs. Madison Walsh's face had gone completely white, and I could see her mother gripping her father's arm. "Additionally," Principal Morrison continued, "the Academic Excellence Award, the Outstanding Leadership Award, and the Community Service Recognition all go to Miss Blackwood, whose achievements over the past 4 years have been truly exceptional." I stood and walked to the podium, accepting the microphone with steady hands. 400 faces stared back at me, most showing confusion, some showing recognition, as they finally began to understand who I was. "Thank you," I said, my voice carrying clearly through the sound system. "Many of you don't know me, which is understandable. For 4 years, I've been overlooked, ignored, and systematically erased from this school's records." The silence was complete now. Even the parents had stopped whispering. I was cropped out of yearbook photos despite earning my place in every organization pictured. My name was removed from honor roll lists despite maintaining the highest GPA in the class. Awards that should have been mine were given to students with lesser achievements. I paused, letting my gaze sweep across the audience until it landed on Madison Walsh. She was shrinking in her seat, her parents flanking her like bodyguards. But here's what those responsible for these actions didn't understand. You can't erase someone who refuses to be erased. You can't diminish someone who knows their own worth. My father sat in the back of the auditorium, having arrived shortly after me. He nodded slightly, his expression proud. "Today, I want to share the truth with all of you. For 4 years, this school's administration has engaged in favoritism, corruption, and deliberate manipulation of academic records. Awards were given not based on merit, but on family connections and financial influence. Now people were definitely listening. Parents were pulling out phones, some recording, others taking notes. The Walsh family, for example, has been major donors to this school for years. That generosity has been rewarded with preferential treatment for their daughter, including falsified GPA records and unearned academic honors." Robert Walsh shot to his feet. "This is outrageous. I demand—" "You demand nothing," I said, my voice cutting through his protests like ice. "You're in no position to make demands, Mr. Walsh. Not anymore." I had prepared for this moment, had anticipated his reaction. From my purse, I pulled out a folder containing photocopied documents. These are the authentic academic records from this school's database, obtained through legal channels by my family's attorneys. They show the systematic alteration of grades and the deletion of achievement records for scholarship students who lacked family connections. I held up the papers, making sure everyone could see them. Madison Walsh's actual GPA is 4.3, mine is 4.7. She was never qualified to be valedictorian. The murmurs grew louder. Other parents were looking around, wondering if their own children had been affected by similar manipulations. Furthermore, I continued, Mr. Walsh's real estate firm has been engaged in fraudulent practices, inflating property values for school district purchases while receiving kickbacks from contractors. The FBI has opened an investigation based on evidence provided by the Blackwood Foundation. This wasn't entirely true yet, but I knew it would be by Monday morning. My father's resources included some very capable attorneys who excelled at building federal cases. Robert Walsh's face had gone red. You can't prove any of this. Actually, I can. I smiled, the expression cold and satisfied. Bank records, email correspondence, forged documents, it's all been preserved. The truth has a way of surviving, even when people try to bury it. Madison Walsh was crying now, her carefully applied makeup running down her cheeks. The girl who had spent 4 years looking down on me was finally experiencing what it felt like to be powerless. In closing, I said, turning back to address the entire audience, I want everyone here to understand something important. Merit matters, truth matters, and when institutions fail to uphold these principles, there are consequences. I gestured toward the banners visible through the open auditorium doors. Those banners represent what this ceremony should have looked like all along. They represent recognition for actual achievement, not purchased privilege. The applause began slowly, started by a few parents who had suspected corruption but never had proof. It grew steadily until most of the auditorium was clapping, even some of the students who had been part of Madison's social circle. Congratulations to the class of 2024, I concluded. May you all remember that your worth isn't determined by other people's recognition, but by your own knowledge of what you've accomplished. I set the microphone down and walked back to my seat, my heels clicking rhythmically against the floor. The sound echoed through an auditorium that had fallen completely silent, except for Madison Walsh's quiet sobbing. The rest of the ceremony proceeded in a fog of whispered conversations and shocked stares. Principal Morrison stumbled through the remaining presentations, clearly unsure how to proceed. The traditional speeches had been canceled. Madison was in no condition to speak, and Kevin Chen had apparently left the building entirely. When my name was called for the various awards, I walked to the stage with quiet dignity. Each trophy felt heavier than it should have, not because of the metal and plastic, but because of the justice they represented. The yearbooks that were distributed after the ceremony told a different story than the ones from 3 weeks ago. This edition, printed by my own company, featured extensive coverage of my achievements, complete academic records, and a detailed explanation of the administrative errors that had affected previous publications. I had ensured that every family received a corrected copy, with a note explaining that the previous yearbooks had contained significant omissions due to database errors that had now been resolved. As families filed out of the auditorium, many stopped to introduce themselves and congratulate me. Parents who had never spoken to me before were suddenly interested in my college plans and future aspirations. Madison Walsh and her family left through a side exit, avoiding the crowd. I watched them through the window as they hurried to their car, a modest sedan, I noticed. The BMW they usually drove had apparently been repossessed. My father appeared at my side as the crowd thinned. How does it feel? He asked. I considered the question. How did it feel to watch my tormentors face consequences? How did it feel to finally receive the recognition I had earned? How did it feel to know that I would never again allow myself to be diminished or erased? It feels like justice, I said finally. Good, because this is only the beginning. 6 months later, I was settling into my freshman year at Harvard, where my real achievements, not fabricated ones, had earned me a full scholarship from the Blackwood Foundation. My dorm room overlooked Harvard Yard, and the autumn air carried the scent of changing leaves and possibility. Madison Walsh was working at a retail store in downtown Westfield, having been unable to secure college admission with her real academic record. Her family had lost their house, their business, and their social standing. Robert Walsh was awaiting trial on charges of fraud and corruption. Principal Morrison had been quietly asked to resign, along with several other administrators who had been complicit in the grade manipulation scheme. Dr. Hernandez had implemented new oversight procedures to prevent future corruption, but perhaps most satisfying of all, the new Westfield High School yearbook featured a special section titled Setting the Record Straight, which detailed the importance of academic integrity and featured prominently displayed photos of legitimate achievement award winners, including several pictures of me. And I kept one of the old yearbooks on my desk as a reminder, the one where I had been cropped out, erased, forgotten. Next to it sat a copy of the corrected version, where my achievements were properly documented and celebrated. The contrast between the two books represented everything I had learned about power, justice, and the importance of refusing to accept other people's definitions of your worth. My phone buzzed with a text from my father. "Board meeting next week. Ready to start taking a more active role in the company?" I smiled as I typed back, "More than ready." In my first life, I had spent years believing that being overlooked was my fault, that I somehow deserved to be treated as invisible. I had accepted crumbs of recognition and been grateful for any attention at all. In this life, I understood that visibility wasn't something you waited for. It was something you demanded. And I had learned to demand it very effectively. The Harvard campus stretched out before me, full of opportunities and challenges that I was finally equipped to meet. I had spent 18 years being underestimated, overlooked, and erased. I would spend the rest of my life making sure that never happened again. As evening fell over Cambridge, I stood at my dorm room window and thought about the girl who had once been cropped out of photos. She was gone now, replaced by someone who understood that the only way to avoid being erased was to become too important to ignore. The graduation banners had been just the beginning. By the time I was finished, my face and my achievements would be impossible to crop out of anything. Some stories end with forgiveness and reconciliation. This wasn't one of those stories. This was a story about justice, served with precision and without mercy. This was a story about a girl who refused to remain invisible. This was a story about power, how to lose it, how to find it, and how to wield it with surgical precision. And it was only the first chapter.